Xi Jinping and Joe Biden meet to de-escalate tensions between the United States and China. All the while, Israel seizes control of Gaza's largest hospital. Meanwhile, aid for Ukraine is beginning to falter, as the sheer volume is beginning to catch up with Western countries, while at the same time, aid is being rerouted from Ukraine to Israel. We'll be talking about these stories and more in this video. On to the first story. Presidents Xi Jinping and Joe Biden met in San Francisco for the first time in over a year. One of the primary goals was to thaw tensions that have developed between the United States and China over the past several years. On the docket was a pretty agreeable and easy to resolve list of issues, from the South China Sea to Taiwan to disagreements over the war in Ukraine and Israel. Issues like China's relationships with Russia and Iran, questions over spying, and concerns over a larger war over Taiwan have fueled a lot of anxiety between the United States and China. All the while, both the United States and China have been dealing with their own internal pressures and challenges. From these agreements though, Biden and Xi agreed on more cooperation on fentanyl, AI, and increased military-to-military communication. And while they did discuss the issue of Taiwan, no resolution was formally agreed to, which isn't really a surprise. I mean, this is the first time that they've met in over a year, but at the same time, it is a good step that they're agreeing to increase military-to-military communication, which is likely to de-escalate tensions and allow more de-escalation channels between the two militaries. Neither Biden nor Xi nor anybody living in the United States or China, or anywhere else for that matter, wants to see poorly managed tensions lead to the world's two largest economies fighting a hot war. With the US entering into an election season and the Chinese economy beginning to stagnate, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza have reminded everybody that this is a very real and present danger, and that both countries really need to work together to avoid a larger war, which could happen theoretically at any point in time. We've discussed these tensions and challenges in this playlist already, so check that out if you're interested in more in-depth analysis. On to the next story. France issued an arrest warrant for Syrian President Bashar Al-Assad over the use of chemical weapons during the Syrian civil war in 2013. The warrant also includes arrest warrants for his brother Maher, as well as two other Syrian government officials believed to have leadership authority during that conflict. This follows a lengthy International Criminal Court, or ICC, investigation into the chemical weapons attack in 2013, which happened in the Damascus suburb of Douma and killed over 1,000 civilians. This is also the first time that Bashar al-Assad has had any arrest warrants over the chemical weapons use. Now, while we're probably not going to see police storm into Damascus and haul Bashar al-Assad out in handcuffs, this does have an impact in preventing Bashar al-Assad from holding financial assets abroad, opening new bank accounts, or being able to travel abroad and meet with other world leaders. Earlier this year, the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin, which has not really had a significant effect on his ability to meet with other world leaders within the Russian sphere of influence or in China. However, that being said, Syria does not have the same kind of global reach and influence that Russia does, so this will likely impact Bashar al-Assad a little bit more than it did Vladimir Putin. Next story. The European Union is set to miss its promise to Ukraine of sending 1 million artillery shells by March of 2024. Meanwhile, the US has had to reroute thousands of 155 artillery shells originally destined for Ukraine over to Israel. Both Ukraine and Russia have militaries that heavily rely on massed artillery fire, meaning that they are constantly chewing through artillery ammunition, and this war has seen millions of rounds being fired. And this artillery dueling has absolutely deformed the landscape of eastern and southern Ukraine in ways that resemble World War I. However, Russia has by far throughout the entirety of the war been able to outfire Ukraine, and this has suppressed Ukraine's ability to launch counterattacks and has devastated civilian infrastructure. And while Russia has been able to fire more than Ukraine, it has also been able to gain more ammunition than Ukraine, not just through the expansion of its own military-industrial complex designed to churn out more rounds, but also through agreements with Iran and North Korea to procure more artillery rounds from abroad. Ukraine, however, has had to rely on the United States and the European Union to gain more ammunition, which both the US and the EU do not have the military-industrial bases to churn out large numbers of ammunition. That's because the US and EU have military-industrial bases that are tailored to a different type of warfare, which is not the type of warfare that Ukraine has, which is more artillery-centric, but one more air-centric and designed on precision. In order to support Ukraine for the long term, both the US and European Union have acknowledged that there needed to be efforts to expand the military-industrial base in a way that could churn out more artillery ammunition. However, this adjustment has taken more time than anticipated and has still not been able to meet the original goals, at least not as of now. Add on to this a massive requirement by Ukraine to provide artillery ammunition to be able to keep up, as well as the needs by Israel for military aid, and you have a bit of a dilemma with limited capacity to support multiple large-scale, high-intensity conflicts conflicts at the same time. This is a dilemma that both the United States and the European Union will have to come up with an answer to, particularly for Ukraine's sake, as the war in Ukraine is closing in on its second year. On to the next story. Last week we briefly covered the breaking news that Israel had agreed to temporary humanitarian pauses. The language here is interesting because they use the word pause, not ceasefire, meaning that these will be localized operational pauses, but will not prevent the IDF from continuing to operate in its invasion of Gaza. Instead, the IDF will issue periodic announcements for when the 4-hour operational pause will be, which will allow civilians to evacuate from Gaza City and move south. This also includes the announcement of a second civilian evacuation route along the coastline. The humanitarian crisis remains particularly severe. Internationally, calls for a ceasefire have outlined the need to address and resolve the humanitarian crisis before the IDF either continues its operations or discontinues its operations altogether. Another concern is that this humanitarian crisis is setting the groundwork for further radicalization among Palestinian children. Opponents of a ceasefire, however, say that a ceasefire would only allow Hamas to reconsolidate its forces, rearm, resupply, and fight harder as soon as the ceasefire was lifted. And instead of allowing a ceasefire, the IDF should continue to apply pressure on Hamas until it is destroyed. Those are all concerns that I've discussed in previous videos as well. The humanitarian crisis has become the subject of a lot of propaganda and counter-propaganda that you'll come across on social media, with both Israel and Hamas blaming each other for harm being done to civilians, as well as civilians being used by either side during this conflict, all in ways that violate the Geneva Conventions. A prime example of this battle is actually in this next story. The IDF has successfully reached and taken control of the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza. This links the north and south axes of advance along the coastline, completely isolating Gaza City from the rest of the world now. It also includes the Israeli seizure of the Gazan parliament building, and with the parliament building now being demolished, operations are now focused on the Al-Shifa hospital. The Al-Shifa hospital is the largest hospital complex in the Gaza Strip, and has sheltered thousands of civilians since the IDF air campaign began at the start of the war. However, US and Israeli intelligence assert that Hamas has been using the hospital to shield its headquarters hidden beneath the hospital. They assert that Hamas knows that the IDF would not strike the hospital, which provides it the perfect cover. Instead, the IDF has opted to move into Gaza and seize the hospital with ground forces. Now, because we're talking about something that will no doubt become the subject of a lot of disinformation and misinformation, let's cover some truths here. Yes, of course, hospitals are protected in the Geneva Conventions. However, Article 19 of the Geneva Conventions outlines the limits of protections that hospitals receive during a time of war. Specifically, if hospitals are used to commit acts harmful to the enemy, in such cases, a warning must be given. And if the warning remains unheeded, then the hospital loses its protected status until it is no longer being used by either side to harm the other. In this case, the IDF asserts that Hamas has been using the hospital to shield its headquarters and to store weapons, and that the IDF had engaged with Hamas fighters outside the hospital complex shortly before IDF soldiers were able to gain entry into the compound. Within the compound, the IDF claims that they discovered weapons caches. And additionally, prior to the raid, the IDF issued a final warning to the Al-Shifa hospital that an operation was going to take place. If it's true that Hamas placed weapons in the hospital complex and placed its headquarters within the hospital, then that would not make the seizure of the hospital by the IDF a war crime. But that being said, I'm not a lawyer. That's just my interpretation of what I read. Let me know in the comments what you think. We will discuss next week how this operation has shaped the war, as the Al-Shifa hospital appears to be a pretty heavy focus on the IDF operation. Finally, I want to issue a quick correction from some previous videos where I said that the United States had placed 2 carrier battle groups in the Mediterranean. In fact, one is in the Mediterranean and the other is in the Gulf of Oman. Whoops. Now, we've covered a lot and I want to hear your thoughts, so comment your thoughts down below and we'll talk about that next week. If you'd like to see more analysis on the war in Gaza, check out this video. Until next time.